In 2010, Dr. Jacqueline Koterick tried breaking into her ex-boyfriend's home by climbing down his chimney. 3 days later, a house sitter discovered her decomposing body inside after she apparently died from mechanical asphyxia. In 2008, a woman from China cut off her husband's beaver cleaver with scissors while he was sleeping, after he reportedly brought another woman home and requested a threesome. While the man was recovering from the surgery that reattached it, his wife cut it off again and threw it out the window. In 1989, Montana woman Patricia Meehan was driving on the wrong side of the highway and eventually crashed into another car. She emerged from her vehicle with a confused look on her face before climbing over a fence and staring back at the wreckage. Patricia stood there for a few moments before wandering into the open field behind her and disappearing into the night. Despite hundreds of reported sightings of her in the months that followed, she hasn't been located to this day. Some investigators suspect Patricia suffered from amnesia as a result of head trauma, but the case remains unsolved. In 1899, brothers George and Willie Muse were kidnapped from their farm in Virginia by a freak hunter when they were just little boys. Born with albinism, they were forced to perform in circuses for the next 25 years under the names the Sheep-Headed Cannibals and Ambassadors from Mars. They were often ordered to partake in disturbing acts such as biting the heads off of snakes or consuming raw meat in front of crowds. The brothers essentially worked as modern-day slaves until their mother found them working for the Ringling Brothers and successfully sued for their release. In 2002, German actor Gunther Kaufmann confessed to falling on his accountant during a fight and accidentally suffocating the man to death with his 260-pound body. The actor was subsequently sentenced to 15 years in prison as a result of the incident. But 3 years later, it was revealed that Kaufman was innocent and had only confessed to protect his dying wife, who had actually murdered the accountant. After a night of drinking in 2010, Michigan man Jeffrey Duthette was sleeping in his bed when his dog Kiko suddenly bit off his toe. When he went to the hospital, it turned out the toe had a bad infection that likely would have spread and killed Jerry if left untreated. Thus, the dog had saved his owner's life. Entertainer and YouTuber Stephen John, aka Blippi, hasn't always been so family-friendly. He began his career as a gross-out video creator under the name Steezy Grossman, and would post shocking videos of himself performing grotesque acts across illicit websites. Most infamously, he performed the Harlem Shake in 2013 while standing unclothed on a toilet and defecated all over his unclothed friend. Despite Steven's regret and extensive efforts to have the video removed from the internet, it can still be found rather easily. Don't try to find it. Please don't. Oh my god, why did I watch it? What the fuck, Blippi? In 2013, unemployed 30-year-old Princeton graduate Thomas Gilbert Jr. shot and killed his hedge fund manager father just hours after being told his $1,000 weekly allowance would be cut down to just $300. He was sentenced to at least 30 years in prison. A Japanese pilot who bombed a town in Oregon during World War II returned 20 years later to present his family's 400-year-old sword as a symbol of regret. His daughter said that if he had received a negative reaction, he would have used the sword to perform seppuku on himself instead. October of 2011, famed narrator David Attenborough found a skull in the garden of his London property. He immediately informed police, who later determined the skull belonged to the victim of a gruesome murder during the Victorian era. Julia Martha Thomas was killed by her housemaid in 1879 before being chopped up, boiled, and fed to local children. There's a room in the basement of Oregon State Hospital known today as the Room of Forgotten Souls. In 2004, hundreds of copper cans were discovered holding the remains of 3,600 mental patients who were cremated on site starting in 1917. Built in 1628, the Swedish warship Vasa was hailed as the greatest warship ever built, but infamously sank just 20 minutes into its maiden voyage, resulting in the deaths of at least 30 people. After it was salvaged in 1961, archaeologists found that the ship was horribly asymmetrical. Apparently, some of the builders had measured in Swedish feet, which was 12 inches, while others had measured in Amsterdam feet, which was 11 inches. The ship was knocked over by a mild gust of wind less than a mile into its voyage. Talented artist Norman Lee worked for Marvel Comics for nearly 20 years until he suddenly disappeared in 2015. He was snorkeling in the Cayman Islands with his wife, but never returned ashore, and his body was never found. In 1996, 16-year-old Jonathan Capewell died as a result of his obsession to smell good. The teenager covered his entire body in cologne at least twice per day until he eventually died from a heart attack. At the time of his death, Capewell had 10 times the lethal dosage of butane in his blood after the gas built up in his body for several months. In 1974, a group of 6 men entered the Hi-Fi audio store in Utah and held everyone inside hostage. The hostages were then subjected to brutal torture, including being forced to drink drain cleaner, which left them with horrible burns in their throats and mouths. One of the victims had a ballpoint pen inserted into his ear that was stomped on until it punctured his eardrum and came out his throat. All 5 hostages were later shot in the head, 3 of whom died. 2 of the perpetrators were sentenced to death, while the 3 other men involved were never caught. Iconic actor Jack Nicholson has faced his fair share of legal controversies over the years. In 1996, he reportedly assaulted an unnamed Hollywood socialite at a party and ruptured her breast implants. Then that same year, he allegedly promised a prostitute named Catherine Sheehan $1,000 for sex and then assaulted her when she asked for the money. Sheehan claimed that Nicholson promptly grabbed her by the hair, thumped her head on the floor, and then threw her out of his house. She received a $40,000 settlement, but later argued that this was insufficient to cover her injuries, including brain damage, which she said was actually killing her. In 1849, Henry Box Brown escaped from slavery by shipping himself in a small wooden crate from Virginia to Philadelphia. Despite the instructions on the box of handle with care and this side up, carriers placed the box upside down or handled it roughly several times. 350 miles and 27 brutal hours later, Brown stepped out of the box a free man and went on to become a magician. When later asked why he went to such an extreme to escape slavery, Brown was quoted saying, "If you've ever been deprived of liberty as I was, you cannot realize the power of that hope of freedom." A teenager from Brazil recently died in one of the strangest ways you'll ever hear of. He crushed up a dead butterfly and mixed the remains with water before injecting the liquid into his leg with a syringe. After continuously vomiting and limping several days later, he was taken to the hospital where he stayed for more than a week before eventually dying from septic shock. The boy never gave a reason for injecting the insect into his bloodstream. Up until 2017, if you caught your spouse in bed with someone else in Uruguay, it was within your legal right to murder either one of them. In 1997, struggling father of 3 Billy Bob Harold Jr. became a millionaire overnight after winning the $31 million jackpot in the Texas lottery. But as friends, family, and strangers continuously pressured him to share his fortune, Harold's spending went out of control, eventually resulting in he and his wife's divorce. Just 2 years after winning the lottery, Harold ended up taking his own life just a few days after telling his friend, "Winning the lottery is the worst thing that ever happened to me." Memoir, when Vice President J.D. Vance was 12 years old, his drug-addicted mother was once driving erratically and threatened to crash her car to kill them both. J.D. had no choice but to jump out of the speeding vehicle and run to a nearby house for help. He now refers to this event as a turning point in his life, since it prompted him to move in with his non-abusive grandmother and work towards a more stable life. In the year 2000, Mexican woman Ines Ramirez performed an hour-long C-section on herself after suffering 12 hours of constant pain. Using a large kitchen knife, she made a 7-inch vertical incision and pulled the baby boy out of her own uterus. Despite no prior medical training, both Ramirez and her baby miraculously survived. In 1996, 16-year-old Travis Lewis pleaded guilty to the murder of Sally McKay. While seeking closure, Sally's daughter Martha visited Travis several times in prison and eventually forgave him for killing her mother. When he was released on parole 23 years later, Martha allowed Travis to move in with her and gave him a job as groundskeeper of her estate. But when she realized the man was frequently stealing from her, Martha fired Travis and kicked him out. Soon afterwards, Travis broke into Martha's home and stabbed her to death before drowning in a nearby lake while running from police. In 2006, 26-year-old Illinois teacher and wrestler Samson Shelton admitted to police that he raped a 17-year-old student before choking her and tossing her body into a wooded area. He then put a belt around her neck to make it look like she was strangled and left her for dead, after which Shelton went line dancing with friends. Suffering from brain damage and a broken neck, the teenager survived but had to relearn how to swallow, walk, and talk. But despite his heinous crimes, Shelton was released on parole just last year after serving out 17 of his 20-year prison sentence. In 2008, a train traveling 70 miles an hour struck and killed an 18-year-old man who was running across the tracks and apparently didn't realize how fast the train was moving. The impact flung the man's body over 100 feet, and his flying body parts knocked a 58-year-old woman to the ground, breaking her wrist, shoulder, and leg. The woman later sued the man's family on the basis that, if you did something as stupid as this guy did, you have to be responsible for what comes from it. 19th century Italian painting is the earliest known depiction of the guinea worm, an awful parasite that has haunted humans for thousands of years. It enters the system through dirty water containing its larva, and grows into a 3-foot-long worm that eventually erupts from the skin, causing an incredibly painful burning sensation. To relieve this, people often splash water onto the affected area, prompting the worm to discharge more larvae into the person's body and start the horrible cycle all over again. There were more than 3.5 million guinea worm cases in 1986, but that number has been significantly reduced in recent years. Armed only with a knife, Master Sergeant Roy Benavides went to assist a 12-man Special Forces team who were surrounded by 1,000 Vietnamese soldiers during the Vietnam War. Following the grueling 6-hour battle, Benavides had 37 puncture wounds, exposed intestines, and a broken jaw. He was pronounced dead until he managed to spit blood in the face of the man who was zipping up his body bag. Benavides eventually made a full recovery and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroic actions. 2022, James Grimes won an air guitar competition while on a cruise to Mexico, which was the last thing he remembered before waking up overboard in the Gulf of America without a single ship in sight. Grimes had to tread water for over 18 hours and endure countless stings from 2 swarms of jellyfish before he was finally rescued by the Coast Guard. 17-year-old Lisa Noland planned to take her own life just before she was abducted by serial killer Bobby Joe Long. He raped her several times and held her hostage for 26 hours until she managed to convince him to let her go. Lisa got the man captured, while the traumatic experience gave her a new lease on life and inspired her to become a police officer. After brutally murdering his ex-girlfriend's parents with a baseball bat in 2001, just last week, South Carolina man Brad Sigmund was executed via firing squad, the first such execution in the United States since 2010. Sigmund was given a choice and opted for firing squad over the other state-approved methods of lethal injection and the electric chair, since he said it was much quicker than the other methods, which have inflicted prolonged and potentially torturous deaths on his friends. Sigmund was strapped to a metal chair with a hood over his head and a target placed over his heart, while 3 volunteer officers fired at him from 15 feet away. Brian Spencer was called up to play in his first NHL game in 1970. He told his father Roy to watch the game that night since he knew he'd be interviewed between periods. But when he couldn't find a broadcast of the game, Roy drove to the nearest TV station in a fury and held the staff at gunpoint, ordering them to broadcast the Maple Leafs game immediately. The station complied, but as Roy was leaving the building, he was confronted by Canadian police and eventually killed after a standoff. The hockey player's life would end up spiraling out of control, as he would also be killed in a shootout after trying to rob his crack dealer. Wow, nice family, huh? During a hunting trip in 1913, race car driver Camille Janatsky hid behind a bush and made animal noises to prank his friend before he was promptly shot. He was rushed to the hospital but died on his way there, fulfilling his own prediction that he would die in a Mercedes. In 1970, U.S. Air Force pilot Captain William Schaffner was ordered to follow a UFO over the North Sea when he ended up vanishing without a trace. A few weeks later, Schaffner's aircraft was found by divers and recovered from the sea. Strangely, its cockpit was sealed and the ejector seat was intact, but Schaffner's body was nowhere to be found. In 1987, North Korean spy Kim Hyun-hui blew up Korean Air Flight 858, killing all 115 passengers on board. After failing to take a cyanide pill afterwards, she told interrogators it was a direct order from Kim Jong-il that she had no way of backing out of without being killed. The woman was originally sentenced to death, but later pardoned by the South Korean president, who said she was merely a brainwashed victim of the real culprit, the North Korean government. Hyun-hui ended up marrying one of her interrogators, and they live happily ever after with their 2 children. While recording the audio version of his book Charlotte's Web, it took author E.B. White 17 takes to read the death scene of Charlotte. He's said to have walked outside for a breather, come back in, and started crying again every time he got to that moment. In 1184, the King of Germany was conducting a meeting with his noblemen on the 2nd floor of a church when the floor suddenly collapsed. The king, whose seat was on a separate section that didn't collapse, watched in horror as 60 of his noblemen drowned in the cesspit located below that hadn't been emptied out in years. 2017, British hairdresser Daryl Rowe was convicted of deliberately infecting 5 men with HIV. He would meet his victims through dating apps before sleeping with them, after which he would send them taunting messages telling them he lied about being HIV negative. Rowe ended up being sentenced to life imprisonment for his evil actions. In 1966, an 18-year-old man entered a beauty school in Arizona before shooting 7 people inside, killing 5 of them, including a toddler. When questioned about his motive, he said he simply did it to get his name out there. Doctor and philanthropist Patch Adams only agreed to the 1999 film about his life because the producers promised to help build his hospital. But none of the profits from the film were ever given to his foundation, and Adams himself said he hated the movie and everything it stood for. In 1955, a pregnant woman was scheduled for a C-section in Morocco, but she fled the hospital after watching another woman die during the procedure. She was in pain for a few days afterwards, but when the pain suddenly disappeared, she simply went on with her life. 46 years later, she was diagnosed with a tumor that turned out to be the calcified baby still inside of her. 13. Well-respected meteorologist Tim Samaras became the first storm chaser killed by a tornado along with his son Paul and friend Carl. The Oklahoma tornado expanded from 1 mile to 2.6 miles in about 30 seconds and was the largest ever recorded. It suddenly took a sharp turn towards the group, leaving them screaming their last words over the radio, "We're gonna die." These were the final photos of extreme cave diver Dave Shaw just moments before his final dive into South Africa's Bushman's Hole. He blacked out at 872 feet while retrieving a fellow diver's body, and his helmet cam recorded his demise. Osama bin Laden's son Omar was severely beaten by his father for smiling too widely when he was a young boy. He trained in Al-Qaeda camps starting at 14 years old, but left the terrorist organization in 2000 since he didn't support the idea of killing innocent civilians. In 2006, Gail Laverne Grimes died in the hospital after surgeons spent 6 exhausting hours trying to separate her skin from a couch. The 500-pound woman had been sitting on her living room sofa for 6 years to the point where her skin had completely fused to the fabric. Rescue workers had to transport Gail in her couch using a trailer, and she ended up dying while still attached to it. Texas father Daniel Shaver was held up by police after he was seen pointing a pellet gun out of his hotel window. Several officers had rifles pointed at Schaefer in the hallway as he attempted to comply with them, but their commands were confusing and contradictory, especially since Shaver was drunk. For example, they told Shaver not to put his hands down for any reason before telling him to start crawling towards them. As Shaver was crawling and begging for his life, he reached back to pull his pants up and was killed instantly by Officer Philip Brailsford, who later claimed he thought Shaver was reaching for a weapon. Brailsford was charged with second-degree murder and found not guilty, since the full unedited footage wasn't released until hours after his acquittal. Brailsford was rehired by the department and reimbursed for all the medical expenses he paid, while seeking treatment for the PTSD he claimed he acquired from the shooting. Because of this, Brailsford was medically retired and now collects a $2,500 pension every month. As a teenager, the late rapper Big Pun was an accomplished boxer and basketball player. But after dropping out of school and battling depression, he became severely addicted to food. He gained about 50 pounds a year for the next decade before dying of a massive heart attack at the age of 28 while weighing just under 700 pounds. One of the traditional ways to make Okinawan snake wine is quite horrific. It involves putting the snake on ice until it passes out, after which it is gutted, bled, and sewn back up. When the snake is thawed out and reawakens, it quickly dies in an aggressive, striking manner. In 1977, the wife of Melvin Carr arrived home one morning and found her husband dead on the floor in their garage, along with 2 young women and a man dead in the trunk of his car. Police determined that Melvin had kidnapped them at gunpoint the night before, raped the 2 women, and gassed them all with a hose connected from his car's exhaust to the trunk. Melvin had apparently passed out from the toxic fumes upon opening the trunk to dispose of them and ended up meeting the same fate as his victims. Junior's gravelly speaking voice is caused by a rare neurological condition he developed in his early 40s called spasmodic dysphonia, which causes the muscles that open and close the vocal cords to spasm involuntarily. Here's what he used to sound like before this condition versus after.
And if somebody dumps something into the river that's poison, and it goes into a drinking water intake, and children drink that drinking water, that is child abuse. I think those vaccines we need to have, again, true double-blind, placebo-controlled trials on that. There's 25% of Americans.
While the true cause is unknown, people who do a lot of public speaking are far more likely to develop this condition. RFK required a titanium bridge in his vocal folds to be able to speak at all, and receives Botox shots in his vocal cords every 4 months. He says it's painful to hear himself speak and feels sorry for those who have to listen to him. On vacation in Bulgaria in 2014, 28-year-old German man Lars Matank got into a bar fight that left him with a ruptured eardrum. He was unable to fly home with his friends due to the injuries, but told them he was totally fine and only planned on staying for a couple extra nights. However, the next day, Lars began acting paranoid. He called his mom and whispered that she should cancel his credit cards because someone was trying to kill him. Security cams in the hotel showed him pacing up and down the halls and peeking out the windows for several hours. After arriving at the airport the next day, Lars saw the airport doctor who gave him the okay to fly. But that's when Lars began shaking and suddenly yelled, "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here." He then got up and sprinted from the office, leaving behind all of his luggage, including his phone, wallet, and ID. Once outside, he was seen jogging from the airport, hopping a fence, and sprinting in the direction of a nearby forest. Lars would never be seen again. Babushka Lady was the name given to an unidentified person who was present at JFK's assassination in 1963. He or she was seen filming before and after the president was shot in the head, but later disappeared into the crowd. That recording may have been crucial in revealing the truth about JFK's killing, but the person has never come forward with the footage. Austrian Mayor Hans Steininger died in 1567 after breaking his neck by tripping on his own ridiculously long beard while running from a house fire. In 2010, a Russian man died after being voluntarily buried alive by his friends. He was simply trying to overcome his irrational fear of dying when the ground suddenly caved in and crushed him. In 2008, a British woman died in one of the most embarrassing ways possible. Her husband admitted he would hook homemade clamps to the woman's nipples and administer electric shocks to turn her on. Apparently, it went a little too far this one time, and the woman was electrocuted to death. The husband was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to at least 20 years in prison. Leader Amy Carlson, aka Mother God, convinced her followers that she was God, a 19 billion-year-old being, and that she could heal people from cancer with the power of love. Amy claimed she had reincarnated 534 times, with her past lives including Cleopatra, Jesus Christ, Harriet Tubman, and Marilyn Monroe. But Amy's health began to rapidly decline after she herself was reportedly diagnosed with cancer in 2020. She was eventually paralyzed from the neck down and begged her members to take her to the hospital, but they refused, and she ended up dying in April of 2021 at the age of 46. When police were alerted, they found her mummified corpse in a state of decay that suggested she'd been dead for several weeks. It was stuffed in a sleeping bag wrapped with Christmas lights, with the face covered in glitter and both eyes removed. Authorities stated it was a makeshift shrine and ended up charging 7 members of the group with desecration of a corpse. Last year, Wisconsin elementary school teacher Madison Bergman faced 10 felony charges for having an inappropriate relationship with her 5th grade student. Investigators were shown disturbing screenshots of their text conversations, in which Bergman would talk about how much she enjoyed making out with the young student. The two also exchanged over 100 letters, love notes, and artwork over several months. She was reportedly still graping him up to 3 months before she was supposed to get married to her fiancé. Bergman has pleaded not guilty to all 10 counts. Ohio sex worker Linda Lassess prompted a multi-state public health alert after police discovered she'd slept with more than 200 clients while knowing she was HIV positive. Officers worked hard to contact her clients and suggest getting tested so they could seek the proper treatment. Randy Woodfield was drafted by the NFL to play for the Green Bay Packers in 1974, but was soon cut from the team due to a series of indecent exposure arrests. He would go on to become the I-5 killer and is believed to have been responsible for over 40 murders throughout the early 1980s. Out in Alaska. In 1981, American wildlife photographer Carl McCunn hired a bush pilot to drop him off in the Alaskan wilderness. He planned on camping by himself for 5 months to take photographs of wildlife, but would soon realize he'd forgotten to arrange for a return flight. As the weather grew colder and his supplies began to dwindle, Carl soon realized that he may never return home. At one point after he lost all hope, Carl was seen by an Alaskan state trooper plane but was ignored because he raised his fist in celebration, and a raised fist is known to be a signal that everything's okay. Referring to this incident, Carl wrote in his journal, "It's certainly my fault I'm here now. Man, I can't believe it. I really feel like a klutz. Now I know why nobody's shown up since." Sometime afterward, Carl ended up taking his own life by shotgun. Carl's campsite and corpse were found a few weeks later, along with his journal which detailed his harrowing final months. 1966, James Meredith, the first black man to attend the University of Mississippi, planned a one-man, 220-mile march against fear to encourage black people to vote. But despite a police presence just 2 days into the march, James was shot in the neck, back, and head by a white supremacist. He was quickly rushed to the hospital and ended up surviving his wounds, while his attacker only received 2 years in prison. Later that same year, James completed the march, by which point over 10,000 people had joined him. James is now 91 and still lives in Mississippi. Depression-era gangster John Dillinger survived a shootout with the FBI, robbed 24 banks and 4 police stations, had plastic surgery to change his face and remove his fingerprints, escaped from prison using a wooden gun, and led the government on a year-long chase that cost them 4 times the amount he had ever stolen. After Dillinger was finally shot and killed by the FBI in 1934, bystanders rushed to the theater where he was killed to soak their handkerchiefs in his blood, while thousands stormed Chicago's morgue to have their photos taken with his corpse.